On a freezing night in November 1930, a weary trapper stumbled into a familiar village. But instead of warm greetings, he was met with a deafening, unnatural silence. Inside the huts, pots of stew were still boiling over smoldering, unattended fires. Rifles, the absolute lifeline of any northern hunter, were left casually leaning against the doors. Every single person had simply evaporated into the pristine, trackless blanket of snow. The Midnight Paradigm. Today, we delve into the haunting enigma of Anjikuni Lake. Joe Labelle was a man who knew the unforgiving Canadian wilderness more intimately than most. For years, he had traversed the brutally cold tundra, surviving entirely by his wits and his snowshoes. The Inuit settlement at Anjikuni Lake was one of his regular and most welcome stops. It was far more than just a temporary hunting camp. It was a thriving, permanent community. Over 30 men, women, and children called this isolated patch of ice their home. Labelle knew these people by name. He had shared meals with them and traded furs by their fires. He recalled the familiar, comforting smell of wood smoke and curring caribou hides hanging in the freezing air. He remembered the sounds of the village dogs barking and children laughing as they played in the snowbanks. It was a place brimming with life, a sanctuary against the deadly chill of the remote north. But as Labelle's snowshoes crunched toward the settlement on that fateful November evening, the air felt profoundly wrong. There were no sled dogs barking to announce the arrival of a stranger. No silhouettes moved across the glowing, translucent walls of the animal skin tents. There was just the howling, bitter wind, and a creeping sense of absolute dread settling in his stomach. Labelle called out, a standard greeting in the local dialect, but his voice was swallowed by the vast emptiness. He approached the first dwelling, carefully pulling back the heavy caribou skin flap that served as a door. The interior was warm. In fact, it was entirely too warm for an abandoned shelter. A fire was still actively burning in the center hearth, casting long, dancing shadows against the empty walls. Suspended directly above the flames, an iron pot held a blackened, thoroughly scorched stew. Beside the fire hearth, a half-finished child's shirt lay casually abandoned on the floor. Bone needles were still resting in the fabric, as if the occupant had simply stood up and vanished mid-stitch. Heart-pounding, Labelle quickly checked the next hut, and then the next. The terrifying pattern repeated with exactness, fires still smoldering, meals abandoned midway through preparation. But the most chilling detail was what the villagers had deliberately chosen to leave behind in the freezing cold. All of their winter provisions, their warmest furs, and their weapons remained untouched. No one survives the tundra without them. Labelle stood in the center of the silent camp, his breath pluming in the freezing air as he tried to process the impossible. He looked down at his own heavy snowshoes, noting the deep, unmistakable tracks he had just carved into the powder. He raised his lantern and began a slow, deliberate circle around the perimeter of the entire settlement. If a group of 30 people, including children and elders, had fled this place, they would have left a heavily trodden path. The movement of that many individuals dragging their bodies through the snow would have churned the ground into a chaotic mess. Yet the snow surrounding Anjikuni was like undisturbed glass. There was not a single footprint leading away from the village. A sudden, terrifying thought struck him. Did they panic and flee across the frozen surface of the lake itself? He rushed to the shoreline, holding his light against the brutal wind, scanning the solid black ice for any sign of a struggle. but the ice was equally untouched. It was as if the villagers had simply ascended directly into the winter sky. The bitter wind howled louder, a sharp, physical reminder of the lethal temperature dropping by the minute. Without their heavy coats, without their rifles or supplies, exposure would have killed them within hours. Labelle frantically turned his attention to the village's food storehouses, desperately searching for a logical explanation. Perhaps disease or an extreme famine had driven the community mad, forcing a panicked, irrational exodus. He found the storage caches completely intact. They were packed to the brim with dried fish and cured caribou meat. They had more than enough provisions to comfortably survive the harshest depths of the long winter. Hunger was definitely not the invisible killer that had driven them from their homes. Then a strange, sickening detail caught his attention near the tree line at the edge of the camp. He waded through the knee-deep snow toward the area where the sled dogs were traditionally kept tied. Sled dogs were the absolute lifeblood of any northern tribe, their primary means of transport and survival. A hunter would sooner sacrifice his own arm than voluntarily abandon his loyal team of dogs. What Labelle uncovered beneath the snow made his blood run completely cold. The entire pack of dogs was still there, firmly tied to their wooden posts under a layer of drift. They had not run away. They had been left behind, starved and frozen to death at their posts. This single, brutal piece of evidence completely shattered every logical theory he had managed to construct. No human threat, no natural disaster would ever compel an Inuit hunter to leave his dogs to such a fate. Paralyzed by a primal, suffocating fear, Labelle stumbled backward, retreating toward the village outskirts. But as he backed away, his lantern illuminated something else entirely wrong at the edge of the settlement. It was the ancestral burial ground. The sacred graves, traditionally sealed with heavy stone cairns, were desecrated. The massive stones had been cast aside with immense force, and the graves themselves were completely empty. Yet the ground beneath the snow was frozen as solid as concrete. It would take a dozen men with steel picks to dig through it. The sight of the violently emptied, frozen graves finally broke the hardened trapper's nerve. He abandoned the warm, smoldering huts and fled directly into the lethal, sub-zero night without looking back. Labelle trekked for hours, pushing his exhausted, frost-bitten body to the absolute breaking point. When he finally reached the nearest telegraph office, he was half frozen and completely delirious with fear. With trembling hands, he hammered a frantic, desperate message to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. The Mounties were men hardened by the brutal North. They did not spook easily. But the sheer panic in Labelle's telegraph was entirely out of character for such a seasoned veteran of the ice. Within hours, an armed detachment of RCMP officers was dispatched into the freezing wilderness. They braced themselves for a gruesome discovery, a violent massacre, a deadly plague, or mass starvation. What they found upon arriving at the shores of Anjikuni Lake was infinitely more disturbing. The Mounties methodically swept the village. They confirmed every impossible detail Labelle had reported. The meals had indeed burned to cinders. The essential rifles still stood perfectly untouched by the door frames. And the sled dogs lay frozen under the snowpack, tragically starved at their wooden posts. But as the investigators meticulously documented the scene, they noticed something Labelle had missed in his panic. Inside several of the huts, they found partially repaired snowshoes and unspooled fishing lines resting on laps that no longer existed. It indicated that, Whatever happened occurred with such staggering suddenness that people didn't even have a second to react. The Mounties then turned their grim attention to the desecrated graves at the edge of the settlement. The heavy stones had not been moved by scavenging animals. The arrangement suggested calculated, intelligent intervention. Furthermore, the earth beneath the graves was completely petrified by the Canadian permafrost. It was physically impossible to dig through that earth without heavy machinery. Yet the bodies were gone. Completely baffled, the investigators widened their search grid, seeking any answers from neighboring outposts. They interviewed another seasoned trapper named Armand Laurent, who lived with his 2 sons. Laurent's isolated cabin was located several miles away, directly along the primary path to Anjikuni Lake. When the Mounties asked if he had seen any mass migration of Inuit people, Laurent shook his head. But what he described next would permanently alter the trajectory of the investigation. Laurent claimed that a few nights prior, the exact time the village vanished, the sky had behaved unnaturally. He and his sons had witnessed a massive, pulsating light hovering silently above the tree line. It was definitely not the aurora borealis. It was a defined, cylindrical object emitting an eerie, shifting glow. And it was moving silently, with calculated deliberation, straight toward the shores of Anjikuni Lake. The Mounties documented the sighting, noting heavily that Laurent was a deeply pragmatic man, entirely prone to facts, not fairy tales. The Mounties returned to the village, their minds racing with the trapper's impossible account of the glowing cylinder. The official RCMP investigation dragged on for agonizing weeks, but it yielded absolutely nothing but dead ends. They scoured the Canadian wilderness, interviewing neighboring tribes and sending patrols to the most distant outposts. Not a single soul had seen or heard from the 30 men, women, and children of Anjikuni Lake. To quell the rising panic in the press and the public, authorities rushed to formulate a mundane, rational explanation. They officially declared that the village had likely migrated, suddenly deciding to follow a seasonal caribou herd. But seasoned northern experts and local trappers immediately tore this fragile explanation to absolute shreds. No Inuit hunter would ever abandon their sled dogs, their essential rifles, or their heavy winter furs to follow a herd. To do so was an immediate death sentence, and 30 people do not willingly walk into the freezing darkness to die. The desecrated graves remain the most glaring, terrifying contradiction to the official government narrative. Why would a migrating tribe exhaust themselves unearthing their own ancestors, only to carry frozen corpses into the wasteland? Without answers, the details of the Anjikuni Lake disappearance slowly began to blur with dark local folklore. Whispers of the Wendigo, malevolent, insatiable spirits of the ice, began circulating among the frightened trappers. Others clung fiercely to Armand Laurent's account of the glowing, cylindrical object hovering in the night sky. They theorized that the villagers were taken, abducted instantly by a force entirely beyond human comprehension. Decades slowly passed, and the unforgiving Canadian winter meticulously reclaimed the abandoned settlement. The wooden poles rotted away, and the animal skin tents collapsed under the crushing weight of endless snowfall. But the mystery of the evaporated village refused to die. It became a permanent, chilling scar on the history of the North. The case forces us to confront a deeply unsettling reality about our fragile existence on this planet. We build our homes, our families, and our histories, believing they are permanent fixtures in the world. Yet Anjikuni Lake proves that an entire society can simply be erased in the blink of an eye. Removed without a struggle, without a sound, and without a single footprint left behind to prove they were ever there. The official RCMP file remains open to this day, classifying the event as an unsolved missing persons case. A neat, bureaucratic label placed over an abyss of terrifying, unanswerable questions. Even now, the shores of Anjikuni Lake remain desolate. Local hunters strictly avoid the cursed waters. If you stand there in the dead of winter, the wind still howls across the smooth, unbroken ice. You might almost hear the faint barking of starving sled dogs or the distant laughter of children. But there is nothing there, just the freezing dark and the chilling absence of 30 human souls. What do you believe truly happened on that freezing November night in 1930? Was it a tragically misunderstood migration, a supernatural event, or something far more sinister? Share your theory in the comments.